Welcome to the BeyondX podcast. I'm your host, Mahia Brahimi, and every week I speak to leading industry experts, trailblazers, and market leaders where we discuss the key topics of our time in detail and have a deep dive conversation on areas like sustainability, technology, urban planning and city design, health and fitness, and more. In today's episode of Beyond Sustainability, I spoke with Jeffrey Beyer. In the first part of our discussion, we unpacked the importance of decarbonization and went over one of the key enablers for the transition to low carbon resources, finance. We expanded on green financing mechanisms, the public sector's role in financing sustainable projects, retail banking and the financial sector's role in green financing, and touched on reducing energy consumption for buildings and the industrial sector. In the second part of our discussion, we delve deeper into the specific technologies and implementation modalities for decarbonization, including carbon capture, utilization and storage, or CCUS, hydrogen and the role it can play in decarbonizing the industrial and transportation sectors, how the electrical grid will adapt to renewable energy supplies, AI and IoT's role in the decarbonization journey, and atmospheric carbon removal. The different discussion points are all timestamped throughout the episode, so you can freely move around as you see fit. Jeffrey is a sustainability strategist with international expertise across climate and energy policy, corporate strategy, green finance, as well as clean tech innovation and acceleration. He is the founder and managing director of Zest Associates, a UAE-based sustainability consultancy. Jeffrey specializes in forming new programs and initiatives to accelerate solutions like hydrogen, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and low-carbon transport. He also helps highly innovative clean tech companies find investment, joint venture partners, and new clients in the Middle East region. Jeffrey has launched innovation programs for utility providers like the UK's National Grid and multilaterals like the World Bank and International Climate Fund. He has helped establish national centers of excellence for renewables and energy efficiency, including the UK Offshore Wind Innovation Hub, National Renewable Energy Catapult, and the South African Private Sector Energy Efficiency Program. He has authored landmark studies on financing a green transition in the Middle East and accelerating the clean hydrogen industry in the UAE, and was instrumental in founding the UK's first clean tech venture capital fund as a public-private partnership, now capitalized with £100 million. He is a serial entrepreneur, having founded climate consultancies in the UK and the UAE, as well as a clean tech R&D company that uses plants to remediate mercury-contaminated soil, cleaning the plants and turning them into biogas. He holds undergraduate degrees in economics and psychology and a master's in environmental change and management from Oxford University. Thank you so much for making the time, and it's a pleasure to have you on the pod.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
I want to start off talking about how you got into things before we get into the technical nitty-gritty side of things. What got you into sustainability? I know that it's something you actually studied, but how did you get into it? What was the evolution of it, if you will, for you?
Yeah, it's a bit of a winding story. I've always been interested in sustainability. I don't know. I did a lot of camping when I was younger. I was in outdoors a lot. I was in Boy Scouts, so you're always in nature. So I had a connection to nature. I'm from Canada originally, so there's a lot of really beautiful nature there. And when I was studying at my undergrad, I actually started studying engineering, so aerospace engineering. I ended up switching into economics and psychology, but during my university period, I joined an organization called Engineers Without Borders, Canada, and it was an international development organization. Through that, I did some overseas volunteer work in Ghana, in northern Ghana in Africa, lived for a number of months with a host family there, doing work with the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. After I left that period, there was a huge drought all across West Africa, and then my family and everyone I knew had to plant their emergency seed to survive, and then there was a massive flood, so everything got wiped out again. So everybody ended up relying on UN food aid. So I was really focusing initially on my career in a human development or international development perspective. After that experience, I recognized that without a stable climate, those on looking to pull themselves up the ladder of development really need this baseline of just a normal weather patterns and predictable weather to do that. I'd also been involved in a lot of international activities. So I joined the UN Youth for Climate movement. I went to COP13 as my first COP, railing against the Canadian government at the time because they were not doing enough in the environment. I studied environmental economics as one of my electives. So I always had this kind of interest in the back of my mind and recognized from an early age that climate change was going to be one of the defining issues of our time. So if I was going to invest my life and career in something with impact, this was the thing to do.
Interesting.
Yeah, I joined an environmental consultancy after I finished my undergrad, but I didn't really have an academic grounding in that, so decided to go back to university, which was where I studied my master's in environmental change and management at Oxford, and then continued my career in the environmental space.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
That's a good story.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's funny you say this because one of the other people I spoke to, Giancarlo, he was also mentioning that he grew up in Florida in the mangroves, and that's the reason he got into not sustainability so much, but really his work is sustainable cities. And it's so funny how that works when you go out to nature at an early age especially, and you see what it is and how beautiful it is and what it can do. It shapes you, and then obviously your experience in a different way, having to see what happened in Africa with a drought and a flood shortly after. It's not a good thing, but it sets the stage in a way, right?
It's very influential. And the other thing about this subject area that I think is interesting, I was good at a lot of different subjects in school. You're good at English and also physics and math and biology and stuff. There's not a lot of careers that have this whole breadth of capability in me.
So true.
Sustainability requires this policy dimension. It needs behavior change. Economics is super important. I think understanding the technical underpinnings of some technologies is really important. So having this breadth of interest areas, I think, is well suited for someone to study sustainability because it integrates across all these different areas. Yeah, that's another aspect of why I think it's a good place to be.
You get to wear different hats. I like that, yeah. You've set the stage perfectly for me here because I wanted to ask you, why is this important? What is this discussion important? Why should we decarbonize and why is the energy transition important, especially as it relates to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, both SDG 13 but also SDG 7, which doesn't get looked into as much. You started the foundations of answering this, but why is this important? What does our effort in this space mean for the short and longer term future?
Sustainability, just from a very practical, just from a very normal, intuitive, I suppose is the word, from a very intuitive perspective, sustainability just makes sense.
Right.
Having a society that is unsustainable is inherently not going to end well. You need to have a sustainable approach to everything in life. And I think that this linear model we've developed where you extract resources, you produce things, you throw things away, it doesn't really make sense in the long term. And ultimately, circularity is very akin to sustainability. And I think those two things from a resource efficiency perspective are quite intertwined. Sustainability also has a lot more than an environmental dimension. It can actually get very broad when you look at the social, the economic, and the environmental components of sustainability. There's a lot to consider. So it crosses gender equity, social inclusion, a whole bunch of things. And that's why we see the SDGs as 17 different sustainable development goals, right? It covers a huge swath of different areas. And it's actually interesting to think of the SDGs because they're not the first time the UN came up with these concepts, right? In the year 2000, there was the Millennium Development Goals, which were the precursor to the SDGs. There was, I think, 8 of them. And it actually shows the degree to which society has become a lot more sophisticated since the 2000. The SDGs are a lot more smart, specific, measurable, and so on. And I think that the Millennium Development Goals set the stage for the SDGs, but didn't have the kind of rigor behind them that I think the SDGs do. And the SDGs really set a helpful international framework around how are we going to approach societal development. What do we as a globe think are the important things for us to really work towards? And then how do we set those targets and achieve them in an actionable, practical way? SDG 13 and 7, so it's the climate one and the energy one, which includes affordable energy, not just clean, but also affordable. Obviously, a huge interplay between those. Yeah, I think SDG 7, when we're talking about affordable and clean energy, those two ambitions or targets, I think, used to be in competition with each other.
Right.
And I'm really heartened to see that a lot of the innovation work that's happened over the past decades, but especially over the past 10 or 12 years, has made the affordability side of the energy trilemma a lot less of an issue. The energy trilemma is like a triangle where you have affordability on one vertice, security of supply, and then environmental impact. And those three things, when the energy trilemma was released, EIC, I think they released the energy trilemma in the past, and they talked about this tension between those three different vertices and how if you wanted to focus on the environment, you had to give up affordability. If you wanted to really make it cheap, they had to be fossil fuel driven. And those three things are no longer really in competition, which I think is really exciting for the energy transition because we're going to see this emergence of low carbon technologies really being the cheapest and also the most secure. That's a good development for SDG 7 in particular.
And what would you say is the reason for that? Is it just that
solar PVs are cheaper and implementing wind projects is cheaper, so it's easier to do? Is the technology easier to implement? What's brought us 20 years down the line to where we are now?
There's been a huge amount of innovation. So technically, we've just learned how to make these machines a lot more cheaply. There's been a massive amount of vertical integration as well in the system. And what that means is instead of having silicon producers be totally separate from people who manufacture PV cells and then those who build them all being different parties, especially in China, we've seen a real vertical integration where the silicon miner is the same guy that produces the panels, is the same guy that installs them. So that just leads to a lot of efficiencies. So there's definitely a technology development component. There's the whole thing around learning by doing. You can really save money and time. If you just get experience doing something, you can improve efficiency that way. We've just seen economies of scale grow enormously. So when you build a bigger factory, you can tend to produce the output of the factory a lot more cheaply. So there's been a lot of reasons for that change.
Makes sense. Okay. I want to touch on the implementations. I want to touch on how this is being used in different sectors. But I think first it's important to talk about a key enabler, which is finance. In my experience, a lot of times when you're talking about these problems, affordability, as you mentioned, it's easier now, but it's still one of the key limiters. People say, okay, we want to do this, but we don't have the finances. We want to do this, but there's not enough investment for this specific thing to happen. And it could be a micro-scale, small single industry company or even a residential retrofit, for example, or it could be country scale, even continental scale projects. So when we're talking about financing, there's a lot of different mechanisms and a lot of different incentives and policies. So obviously the Inflation Reduction Act was just passed in the US. It's going to be implemented soon. There's a lot of things in mainland Europe, both on the EU bloc level and in the country level, that are being implemented to finance these different types of projects, renewables, retrofits, whatever else you will. So what I wanted to do is first get your thoughts on just the overall side of this. What is green financing? What does it mean? Who is doing it? Who's getting the benefits of it? Who can make use of it? And then we can go more into detail there.
Yeah, finance is one of these key drivers. We've talked a bit about technology development. One of the things I think is actually the only bright spot in the latest IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, the UN panel, and the only bright spot in their most recent report was the fact that we actually have almost all of the technologies that we need to achieve 90% of our decarbonization goals. We don't have everything, like getting those last bits of very hard to abate sectors is challenging, but for the most part, we've sorted it out from a technology perspective. The real question now is around how do you deploy those technologies? And that comes down to finance, as well as other things. But finance is the big driver. I think green finance essentially refers to any kind of product or service or investment that supports sustainable and environmentally friendly economic activities. It means like money going into something that's reducing environmental impact or leading to the betterment of the environment. It's like green bonds, sustainable bonds, responsible investment strategies, green finance frameworks, green taxonomies. All of these things relate to and support the green finance ecosystem. And there's lots of players, right? So you've got big multilateral funds like the Green Climate Fund or the Global Environment Facility. Those are run by the World Bank and multilateral organizations. At a national level, there's a bunch of green finance programs, green finance frameworks. The UAE actually has a green finance framework that was released, I think in 2018, maybe 16, and they've advanced quite a bit in terms of developing the infrastructure around their green finance frameworks and regulations. Companies can borrow money from capital markets and put them towards green projects. There are big funds that raise money from insurance companies or pension companies or just any kind of fund manager, and their remit is specifically to invest in green projects. It doesn't matter who you are, there's a bit of green finance for you somewhere in the ecosystem. The thing that ties them all together is what this money is being used for. And that money is being used for investments into something that reduces the environmental impact of living. I think that there's another class of investments that's coming out called sustainability-linked bonds and sustainability-linked loans. The key part is the linked, so it's not just a green bond or a sustainability bond. It's a linked one. And the difference about a linked asset versus a non-linked one is that companies that raise money for a sustainability-linked bond, for example, don't actually have to use the money that they raise to invest in specifically something green. The only criteria is that they need to have set meaningful climate change targets or SDG, sustainability targets, ESG targets. They have to have set those targets. And that's it. You can raise money on the capital markets and invest in business as usual activities as long as you've set a meaningful sustainability target.
Okay.
So what this does is brings a lot of people and companies who otherwise would feel excluded from the climate and sustainability conversation. It brings them into the fold by allowing them to raise money on using a sustainability-linked instrument without having necessarily to put that specific pot of money that's raised into a green project. As long as they're on a trajectory to improve their sustainability, then that's enough.
So is that sort of indirectly helping them become more sustainable through...
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So, boy, oh boy, everyone's so excited about this, right? This market has taken off like wildfire. It's bigger than the green bond market. I think the first sustainability-linked asset was listed in 2017. Within 3 or 4 years, it got bigger than the green bond market.
Wow.
Good news, bad news? I don't know, man. I think it's super risky, actually.
I feel like, I'm not so... When you were saying it, I was like,
I don't know.
I don't know how...
No, honestly, it's really risky. So I think that this is a huge asset class. It's something that's going to really dominate the green finance conversation in the next little while. I think it comes with some really material risks. First of all, what is a meaningful target mean? Meaningful according to who?
And that's the thing. Who manages that?
Nobody. So right now, it's a self-described meaningful target. It's not linked to something like, for example, there's something called SBTI, right? It's the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI. They describe what it means to have a meaningful target according to the climate science. So if you have a emissions reduction target in your company that is SBTI aligned, it means that like by 2050 for sure, you're going to be net zero, and probably before that, because in order to achieve our climate change targets, there's science that backs it up, right? Mm-hmm. That's where these targets come from. So,
and break this down for me. How does it work? You go to a company and say, okay, this is what I want to do. This is what my plan is. Give me some money.
Essentially, yeah. It's almost like a self-reporting, almost voluntary disclosure type thing. So yeah, the first risk is like meaningful. Like, what does meaningful mean? I think the second thing is, and there are penalties involved, but if you fail to achieve your targets, there's no strict penalty. There's a penalty, but it's not very strict. The purpose of raising this finance is that you're supposed to be able to raise it with a lower interest rate. That's what motivates companies to list these products. Anyway, but the penalty is low. There's a whole bunch of issues with sustainability-linked financing, but I think it's important to bring into the conversation because it is something that's growing so quickly and that people seem excited about because it has the word sustainable in it. But it's really open for, I think, abuse and risk without some kind of more clear structure.
Yeah, you just made me think of green coal, and let's not go there, but yeah. Okay. Is there anything else on green financing? Is there any other types or...
There's tons of types.
Give me a few more. The ESCO model is obviously another one. We've had a conversation on this already on the pod, but what kind of role do you think that's going to have?
I think ESCOs, they're such an elegant model. I love ESCOs. I did a big piece of work in Turkey around helping to define what a super ESCO could be. I believe you've spoken with Stéphane Gentil, who used to be head of the Etihad ESCO, which is the super ESCO by definition. In
Dubai, and he also helped set up the one in Abu Dhabi, so shout out if you haven't seen the episode, check it out.
No, ESCOs are great, and I actually met Stéphane probably 10 years ago when I was doing this piece of work. He was a leader, a real pioneer in this space, and I was really interested in it because it is a really elegant way to invest in energy efficiency. Mm-hmm. Energy efficiency is such a challenging thing to deploy. We talked about lots of technical solutions being out there, but then not getting financed. Energy efficiency is like the classic, like I don't know what you call it, black swan, or just like something that like never really works out. Black sheep, I guess is what you call it. And you always wonder, like, why is this market not taking off? These investments make sense.
And it saves you money. In the long term, it saves you money.
And even in the medium term or even short term, there's so many ways that it saves you money, but people aren't interested. And this is where ESCOs really knock down those barriers to take it upon themselves to really manage the energy efficiency of a building or of an asset. And they're dedicated and have the real expertise and can raise finance to do that. No, I think ESCO models are a really intelligent, elegant way of raising money and just aligning incentives. A lot of times incentives between a building owner and an occupier and a bank are misaligned, and ESCOs bring all of those incentives under the same banner and can raise money to invest in energy efficiency projects.
Perfect. I want to come back to this in a bit,
Yeah,
but I
sure.
think let's go full circle on the green financing first.
Yeah.
I mentioned government policies and public initiatives. Obviously, super ESCOs in the Middle East are usually government funded. So in UAE, in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, in Saudi, they're all publicly backed.
Yeah.
But of course, they can exist privately as well. But in general, when we're talking really large scale investment in sustainability, it usually comes on the government level. I mentioned the IRA. There's a lot of policies in the EU and Europe. Canada obviously has quite a few to varying effects, let's say. What are your thoughts on these? Do you think the government and public sector really need to play a big role? Is there some examples of the ones I just mentioned or other ones that you think are really good examples? Is there some that won't really go far enough? What are your thoughts on this?
The public sector is absolutely responsible in a huge way for mobilizing money in the right direction. I think that like everything, this is an emergency, right? The climate change is a genuine emergency, and it's difficult to appreciate that sometimes when you're just going about your daily life and you see everything happening normally around you. But this is becoming more and more challenging to actually achieve these targets, these reduction ambitions, and this like massive economic transformation that we're looking for. It requires a huge amount of money. The returns are there. The costs of inaction are much greater, but it just means that we need to reorient our economic system in a way that deploys money towards those low carbon solutions and removes it from those high emitting areas. And currently, there is no price on carbon for most places. So there is this lack of an economic motivator to move money away from those carbon intensive activities towards low carbon activities. So in the absence of that market mechanism, you need to fill that gap with policy. And that's where the government's responsibility comes in. The governments have a responsibility not only to finance low carbon things, but to put in the policies and regulatory frameworks to channel the money that's going to be spent anyway on certain services towards those ones that are lower impact, lower carbon. For example, countries need electricity, and without a price on carbon, in some cases, high-emitting electricity can be cheaper than the low one.
Right.
And that's not right. That shouldn't happen. And I think if we were to integrate the social cost of carbon into the emitting electricity source, then the scales get tipped towards the low-carbon solution. And when I talk about the social cost of carbon, this is essentially where the idea of a carbon tax comes into play. Like historically, we've had a situation where companies, organizations, individuals can emit carbon as if it was a cost-free action, when we know that the buildup of that carbon in the atmosphere creates devastation environmentally. And we're seeing that manifest with kind of insurance payouts every year going higher and higher, huge disasters and unquantifiable challenges in terms of human suffering and so on. There's this massive social cost of carbon, and quantifying that in a dollar term is precisely where a carbon tax fits. People argue that the carbon tax isn't the most efficient way of reducing emissions because it penalizes every ton of carbon equally. A cap and trade system which allows actors to find the lowest cost of reductions and avoid reducing the most expensive ones for now. You can trade the cheap ones for the expensive ones to get a more efficient outcome. So there's this contrast between effectiveness and efficiency sometimes. So a carbon tax is super effective. A cap and trade system, because of its administrative challenges and issues around pricing, can be less effective but more efficient. The point is that a government is required to take some action on either way you price carbon. That's one area. I think in general, then I actually wrote a big report on financing a green transition in the Middle East. It was funded by HSBC and delivered with the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government. There we looked at, specifically in the Middle East, these different mechanisms to use public money in a way that mobilized private sector capital towards sustainable investments. And I broke that down into a couple of different categories. So we looked at the enabling environment, so things that created the conditions for finance to flow, and also specific tools and mechanisms. So that was more direct investments in the sustainability from the public sector. I can go through all the different areas, but essentially it showed that a couple of key takeaways. The Middle East in general, and the Gulf specifically, has an outsized opportunity to use public money to influence the financial conversation because public spending as a share of GDP in the region is quite high compared to international averages. Like in Saudi Arabia, I think 20% of the GDP is public money, which compared to 17% on average globally. So that gives the Saudi government this huge additional capability, this leverage point to use that public sector money to move money from the private sector in the right direction. There's a lot of ways that the public sector can use its money to influence the way everyone else spends. So yeah, 100% there's a huge opportunity. I guess it's a couple of areas in the Middle East that are interesting, especially is the size and strength of state-owned enterprises.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an area where many countries in the world don't have this state-owned commercial heft. Here, the government can instruct in some ways the state-owned enterprises to use their public remit to achieve sustainability goals that the government set. Sovereign wealth funds, likewise, are super powerful in the region. They make up like 30 or 35% of the global size of sovereign wealth funds. They can also decide in their investment strategies to focus not only on commercial returns, but also on things that achieve social objectives, including environmental ones. Those are a couple of areas where the region has a particular advantage, I think.
Okay. What are your thoughts on carbon offsets? It's getting a lot of negative press these days. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that they definitely have a role to play in achieving low carbon transition. There's a lot of projects that wouldn't be financed without the presence of carbon offsets. For those who don't know, you essentially pay into a project that reduces emissions, and you can quantify the amount of emissions that are reduced. You can codify that in terms of saying, I've reduced 10 tons of emissions, you get 10 carbon credits, each worth 1 ton, and then sell those on the market. Right now, voluntary credits are like $6 or €6 a credit. Ones in a mandatory market are closer to 20 or 40, dollars a ton. That goes up and down. Essentially, carbon credits and carbon offsets allow for a transfer of money from people who want to reduce their emissions into projects that otherwise wouldn't be viable without the revenues from carbon credits. It can really support otherwise uneconomic activities, which would just be left on the table as underutilized potential. So yeah, there's a role for carbon offsets. If you look at it from a totally global perspective and try and do the energy and the carbon balance, sometimes the emission reduction commitments of countries are based on their business as usual trajectory. So if a country is expected to grow its emissions by, let's say, 10,000 tons, but they do some activities that reduce that growth to only 5,000 tons, you can sell offsets for those 5,000 tons that weren't ever increased.
Right.
But that doesn't actually reduce the absolute volume of emissions in the atmosphere. It just makes sure that it didn't happen compared to a anticipated business as usual trajectory. So I don't know. There's a bit of uncertainty around whether it's genuinely bringing down emissions. It's reducing the increase, which is still important, right? So that's why I think
yeah, but in an absolute sense is different to a net reduction.
That's right. It is. But I think that the point is that the business as usual trajectory is agreed, and that would probably happen. I think what's critical is making sure that business as usual BAU trajectory is really accurate and not overstated. Because if you pretend that you're going to emit way more in 10 years than you do today, that gives you this huge wiggle room that isn't good for the environment, right? And that's not good either.
Okay. What about green financing from the private financial institutions? So banks do some general green financing. There's some schemes, even in the Middle East, I think, where, for example, your consumer goods like laundry, if you buy an efficient one, you actually end up paying less than a non-efficient one, even though the dollar amount of a non-efficient appliance is usually lower. And I think, first of all, I talked again about this with Stefan, but in the long term, people don't realize this. If you're paying for your own electricity at home, you will save in 2-3 years. If you're buying your own appliances, you will save very quickly the difference of a non-efficient compared to an efficient one. Yeah. The extra money you pay, you will save tenfold in the lifetime of that product. But people don't think about it because, first of all, it's not really advertised, but also because people just don't think about it. They just want to buy the cheaper thing. So this is sort of meant to incentivize that. But what are the financial capabilities? I know it's much too micro for you, but what are the ones you know about?
Yeah, this lifetime cost of ownership thing is one of the big issues around things that have a higher upfront capital cost but lower operating costs. And this is the issue that dogs a lot of sustainability products, including renewables. It's cheaper to build a gas plant if you don't consider like the upfront cost of the gas plant is relatively low compared to a wind or solar plant. But with wind and solar, it's free fuel, right? It's just sunshine and wind. Whereas with the gas plant, you're left to the vagaries of the international markets, and you need to just keep paying for fuel for the whole lifetime of that plant. This whole upfront capital cost versus long-term operating cost and total cost of ownership is a challenge, and we need those types of financial mechanisms like this private banking solution to come into the field. Honestly, I think that there's a lot more that the retail banking sector and the financial sector in general could be doing to support this move towards sustainability. It's a bit of a controversial view maybe, but I just think that every other sector has been required to completely transform the way it imagines itself to align with the low-carbon future. If you asked BMW or any car maker 20 years ago, we want you to sell cost-competitive cars, but you're not allowed to use gasoline anymore. That's totally untenable, right? From a traditional perspective. And this is why electric vehicles didn't take off for so long, because it's hard to do and required a huge amount of upfront investment and a total transformation of all their factories. And it was not an easy thing to just create an electric vehicle industry. But today, we're seeing this takeoff point of electric vehicles. And it's the same with industrial sector, producing no carbon cement or steel. Very hard to do without a lot of R&D and investment. But today we have low carbon neutral, carbon negative concrete through innovation, not widely uptaken, but it's there. We're building low carbon steel plants through direct reduction and using hydrogen and so on. The point is all these industries have had to totally reimagine the way that they do business. And I feel like the financial sector sometimes is comfortable saying we have a fiduciary responsibility, it's not our money to invest, we have certain risks we have to live with. And I think there's a lot more space for creativity there. I think there's a need to be a little bit more comfortable with risk. And I think in particular in developing and emerging economies where interest rates are very high for investment projects, there's another big opportunity for private capital in those markets to really be deployed. And I recognize that risk is a real thing. I think actually in that particular case, looking at investing in developing and emerging economies, this is where I think there's a huge opportunity for the public sector to play a role. A lot of the big green finance initiatives operate on the co-investment terms, so they'll pay for 10% of the asset and mobilize 90% of the money, but the risk is still there sometimes. So I think that there's a real opportunity for the public sector to manage the risk in particular and focus on guarantees, risk insurance, currency risk hedging, these things that a lot of private sector investors are really nervous about. Focusing public money on those areas, I think, could unlock a huge amount of private capital that is needed, especially to help build the technologies that allow developing and emerging economies to leapfrog into a clean future.
I think especially now with the inflationary measures and the impact they're having on interest rates, if you just cap interest rates for green investments, for example, that could be a big thing that the federal banks and the national banks can do, right, to support these investments.
Definitely. And central banks have been thinking about how they can play a role as well. I was speaking with somebody from BIS, it's the central bank of central banks, and he explained that there's this concept they've developed called this green swan phenomenon, right? So you're familiar with the black swan phenomenon where no one thinks a black swan can exist until you actually see it and then it's a real thing. And this green swan issue is a little bit different in that we see the financial macroeconomic risks of climate change and we know they're going to happen, but we don't quite know when or how. There's going to be huge disruption. And central banks try and be very policy impartial. They focus on macroeconomic stability. But this proposal is that climate change and environmental degradation are systemic risks to the financial sector. So there's a role for the central bank and all central banks to play in creating that macro environment that allows for investments to be directed towards these low carbon activities. And there are different ways to do that. You can risk weight different lending. So if you're lending towards a green project, it has a lower risk weighting. If you're lending towards a brown project, so to speak, it has a higher risk weighting. And that creates this macro driver to avoid investments into polluting things and encourage those ones to invest in polluting things. And I think it's a step maybe some central bankers are uncomfortable taking because it does mean that central banks play in a more politically charged space, as if this is a political issue, but it's one that I think
the safety of the planet is very much a political issue. It's crazy to me that's the case, but it is.
Exactly. I think what I'm saying, there's a lot of opportunity for this type of innovation, and I think the financial sector has gotten away with playing around the edges a little bit for a while, and now it's time for them really to think really transformatively. And that's not to denigrate this sector. I think that they're doing a lot, but they're now a bottleneck to really move forward.
But I think that's the thing. I like what you said in the beginning, the indirect impact of sectors that are not really reliant on energy to some degree, or even the ones that are. For example, I just booked a flight recently, and I have the option to offset the carbon footprint of my flights with an investment by them. Now, I don't know what they're going to do. So that's always a question that I have in my mind, is how regulated is that aspect of it? But the options there, where you can buy something from international shipping companies, and then they plant a tree to offset the carbon that they've impacted from your transaction. And I think those are the little things that you could do. I just feel like when we bring the consumer into the game, it's almost the same thing as recycling, right? We're saying, okay, it's your fault, so you need to deal with it. But really, it's the macro level things that need to be changed. So as much as I can offset my own flight, it makes more sense for the airline just to use more sustainable fuel and hydrogen and whatever else, which we'll obviously get into. But that's my thinking. It shouldn't be up to the consumer. It should be up to
I totally agree.
The user of the energy.
I totally agree. There's this thought, I don't know if I read this somewhere, but essentially it said Thomas Edison invented the light bulb by candlelight, right? It wasn't that he wanted to use candles. And I think we're in a system, essentially. Right. It's basically saying you're in a system that has a certain amount of technology or whatever.
True. Yeah.
And you can try for this light bulb society, but we get to operate within the parameters that we're in now.
Right.
And it's about changing those parameters, and not every individual has that control, right? You need a bigger entity like the government to influence that. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, I think we've talked about the financial side of things enough. Let's talk about the implementation. I like what you said, that 90% of the technology already exists, and I really want to tap into that a bit more to set the stage a bit. The bulk of energy consumption in most of the developed countries is in the industrial and transportation sectors. So in the US, it's roughly 60% of the energy consumption. In the mainland European countries and EU countries, it's closer to 65. That's based on the estimates I could find, so correct me if I'm wrong. And then obviously buildings, both commercial and residential, account for the last 40 or so percent that ends up being there. Is that correct? To your knowledge?
Yes, roughly, yeah.
So I joke, but it's funny. I really spent a good 30 or so minutes trying to find these numbers. And I looked everywhere I could possibly look. I looked at the DOE in the US. I looked in both the EU and individual country numbers. I looked on Google for sort of the UN level things. It was very difficult to find accurate numbers. Some date back to 4 or 5 years ago. Some I'm sure were not accurate. And I just don't know. And I feel like maybe that's somewhere we can start. Where should people go to get this information? Is there somewhere that is keeping this information that we can find easily?
It's a good point, actually. It's not, because I was looking for these numbers myself, and I found them ultimately, I think in the EIA, so the Energy Information, what is it even? It's the American EIA, right?
Yeah.
So they had their own numbers, but there's not a really great database. Honestly, there is. I've come
thought
across
on the
them.
UN website, given that it's part of the SDG implementation model, there would be something along these lines. I couldn't find anything.
There are a few good ones, and I think maybe I can find them and you can put them in the comments of this afterwards.
If you can, that'd be great, but I feel like my point is more to the fact that I'm someone who's relatively in the industry. Yeah. You're clearly in the industry, and it's not easy to find for us. So someone who's not looking for this information outwardly is never going to find it. And that's the thing. But let's stay on topic. So implementation, we touched a bit on retrofitting. And as I said 5 times now, I did an episode with Stefan on the subject. But just for those who didn't get the chance to see it, retrofitting in essence, especially when we're talking about the built environment, is usually talking about when you go in, change some of the technology to make it more energy efficient usually. Nowadays, it's also going in more towards the smart buildings. So there's data capturing technology that goes into play. There's smart assistants, so integrating Alexa and other similar platforms into the building to monitor what's happening. But that's the explanation of retrofitting. We touched a little bit on the ESCO model. It's something that's been very successful in this region. What are your thoughts on the role that retrofitting plays, given that buildings are about 40% of the consumption? How important is it? What role does that play? Give me your thoughts on this.
For sure. When we think about buildings, a lot of times people think about new buildings, right? Which are super important, but retrofitting is very important, especially in countries where there's a lot of old buildings, right? So if you look at Europe, a lot of countries have old buildings. Yeah, retrofitting is absolutely critical. A lot of countries have developed a rating scheme, so you can look at a rating between A and G often, where A is very energy efficient and G is really terrible. And often, if you get an energy performance evaluation or a certificate, you can look at the top measures that you can implement to change your building or your home from a D to a B rating, for example. A lot of those involve energy efficiency measures, and many of those energy efficiency measures can be cost positive, so you can actually save money in the medium term. Retrofitting is critical. I think that, like we said, it's a bit difficult to align incentives sometimes, especially if people are renting or leasing buildings. There's a misaligned incentives between those who operate them, those who pay for the operating bills, those who lease them. So yeah, retrofitting is a critical component of managing the built environment. I think it's interesting when you come to new builds. I don't know if we want to talk about that too.
Sure, yeah.
There's a lot of different certification schemes. So there's LEED and there's Energy Star and a whole bunch of different.
Estidama here as well.
Exactly. And they're really important, but they're funny. I went to a LEED certified building in the UK a little while ago and walked in, and there was no light fixtures in the whole thing, because when you have a light fixture, it takes away a point on your certification scheme.
Even if it's efficient lighting?
It didn't matter. So they just didn't include any lighting at all in the home, only like sockets where you could plug in lamps. It was a way to, and they have like bike racks outside, lots of them, right? And I was like, okay, this is fine.
I've never heard this.
It
wow,
was
that's
so
crazy.
bizarre.
That's insane.
It was so bizarre. And there's always ways to like skirt around these rating schemes. But anyway, I thought it was a funny change. Yeah, essentially efficient appliances are absolutely critical. And I think that it's surprising how quickly things get more efficient.
Yeah.
So like an old fridge really does need replacing after a while, even if you look at the life cycle cost of that fridge. Yeah,
but I think that's the thing. You brought a good point, because I haven't talked about new build for a while. And the reason I think is there's a lot of good policies. Maybe this example you're talking about isn't the best one, but I've seen a lot of the LEED certified buildings. They implement certain characteristics that need to be applied, that certain policies that need to be adopted, let's say, that make new buildings a lot more efficient than existing buildings. And a lot of times it's about going back to a building that was built 30 years ago with a completely different everything, right? The MEP is different, the concrete's different, the windows and the insulation is different, the heating or the cooling in this region is completely different to what it would be. And you have to go in and change each of those things, because it doesn't make sense to just break down the building completely and build a new one, right? That's also not efficient.
Yeah.
So I think that's why I always talk about retrofitting. But it's a good point. New buildings definitely need to be as efficient as possible as well. And
there's something called embodied carbon. So it's the amount of carbon that's contained in the material that's used to build it and the emissions that are emitted when you actually bring the equipment and so on to site. And often, in the embodied carbon in a building can often be about like 30 or 40% of the total emissions of that building.
Wow.
So it means you can operate the building for 50 years, but the emissions from the first 6 months or 1 year that it took to build it represents a huge amount of
I didn't even know that. Okay, so refurbishment is really the way to go, because if you don't retrofit and you just break it down and build it again, it's...
Exactly.
Damn, okay.
And it's also super expensive to retrofit things compared to just doing the right thing or the most efficient thing
100%,
when you start building.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. It makes sense, right? Because the building is built and then you're going to go back in and try to remove it. It's not, even human surgery is difficult, but it's not even that simple, because it's like you're going into places that you can't really be going into to change things that interconnect the entire building, especially if it's a big building, then it's really rocket science.
Exactly. Or doing any kind of, in this region especially, district cooling is a real opportunity, and air conditioning takes up I think 70% of the electricity load.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is huge. And the difference between the wall-mounted air conditioner versus chillers versus district cooling is, I think it's a 4-to-1 ratio between district cooling and a wall-mounted.
Depends on the scale of the building and the area, but
and
it's much more efficient.
Exactly. But it's really hard to retrofit a building that has wall-mounted air conditioners with a district cooling system.
You can't really do it. I don't see how you would do that.
No.
Replacing you just need a completely new MEP. Yeah.
Exactly. If you thought about that at the beginning, it would be much, much cheaper, and the operating costs would be cheaper. This again comes back to the same issue though around it costs a little bit more to implement these energy efficiency measures when you're doing the build, but the energy savings more than pay for that additional upfront capital cost. And I think that's where, again, back to this financing thing, we can just get loans to offset that upfront cost, because you're going to save the money over time.
Yeah, and ESCOs and super ESCOs take up some of that cost as well in other scenarios. But you made me really think, a building that, for example, has something that you can retrofit. I'm sure there's some kind of modeling that's done for this, but with the new technologies, digital twins and whatnot, where you can take in all the building data, put it into a software, do a simulation, and see, okay, is it better if I just break this completely down and build a new one, or is it long-term better for the environment at least if I just do small bits and bobs here and there, maybe use more efficient wall-mounted ACs rather than central cooling in a new building. So I'm curious how that ends up. I don't know if you know of any technologies that are doing this.
I don't know, actually. Actually, there are some, I think they do modeling. There is modeling software.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I think there's something interesting too is when new technology comes to the fore, like building integrated building integrated photovoltaics, BIPV.
Yeah.
I remember I was doing some work for a perovskite company a while ago. Perovskite is that type of solar panel, essentially. It's like a very thin, almost translucent
like the film
material.
Solar PVs?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can cover a window in this perovskite material. It almost tints the window.
Mm-hmm.
And in the region, every window is tinted anyway, right? Because the sun is quite intense. So it doesn't actually take away from the visual aspect of things. But it essentially makes every window a solar panel. So you can generate a relatively small amount of electricity from this perovskite-coated window.
Mm-hmm.
But it means that the whole building is like a power plant. When the sun shines or reflects even, it can turn some of that incoming sunlight into electricity and power the building. Very interesting, and I think especially relevant for the region here. And those are technologies that cost a bit to retrofit, but once you do, it's not...
But that's very expensive, right?
Yeah, it's expensive.
It's very expensive. I think if that's the kind of thing that the cost comes down, and obviously if you've built the buildings in a way that has enough sun exposure, for example, that's really the next big thing, I think. 'Cause rooftop solar is great, but it's just so limiting. In a skyscraper that's 50 floors up, you have much more window space than you do roof space, no matter what you're doing, especially because, again, Stefan said this, a lot of times on the top floor is where you have your
equipment,
central cooling systems and MEP things ending up there. So it's always better to, if you could do it on the windows. That's the next big thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
What about industrial scale?
In terms of solar?
No, retrofits in general. And of course, let's talk about energy efficiency first, and then we can make our way to renewables.
The opportunity for industrial energy efficiency is enormous. A lot of times, energy makes up a big component of the industrial bill, and like energy bill is a big cost. Industries that are well run, or companies that are well run in an industrial scale, tend to actually have their finger on the pulse often of energy efficiency measures that can be done. They typically have energy managers. A commercial building won't necessarily have an energy manager. They'll have someone who knows how to operate the system, but isn't necessarily optimizing it for performance. In an industrial scale, the incentives are a bit different. So I've actually found that, especially in environments where energy is relatively expensive, industrial players tend to have a fairly good handle on what they can do. That doesn't mean they're maximally efficient by any means, though. So, for example, I did a piece of work in South Africa looking at establishing a big industrial energy efficiency program, and the big limiting factor there was, first of all, people who had the capability to do energy audits, and then those who really knew after the audit was done, how to right-size equipment and do the economic calculation to figure out if we were to place the chillers and the fans and the pumps and drives, what is the actual cost of that replacement, and then how does that achieve benefits? What's the economic break-even point, essentially, and how much of these energy efficiency measures should we do where we earn our revenue back in 4 years or 6 years, whatever the time horizon was for the company. So you need sometimes these big programs that bring together that kind of technical expertise, but also the economic capability to really figure out what it is that makes economic sense. I think there's a difference, too, between big, huge, heavy industry and medium energy-intensive industries. And we can think about iron, steel, glass making, cement, ceramics, aluminum, right? These are the really heavy, brute force, 1,200-degree heat type of industries. And then they know what they're doing when it comes to energy, because energy is a huge part of their bill. Yeah. When it comes to things like bakeries or dairies or honestly, these are still medium energy intensive, right? Bakeries use a lot of heat. Dairies use a lot of coldness.
That's true, yeah. Restaurants as well, yeah.
Restaurants, exactly. And these guys are often just focused on their core business more so than their energy bill. And I think there's a real opportunity in that medium energy intensive industry where there are fewer players, but or there's more players.
Their consumption is lower.
But their consumption is lower. I know the Carbon Trust in the UK focused a lot on industrial energy efficiency for these medium energy intensive industries and came up with really neat solutions. Like in bakeries, for example, they used, instead of having metal trays that go into the oven where you bake bread, they used silicone trays instead, because silicon doesn't get cold outside of the oven and then need a bunch of heat to warm up. The metal actually absorbs a lot of heat and then it gets let up, right? So by changing the material, the bread baked just fine, but it used a lot less. Like the oven didn't have to heat up all this metal and then let it all cool off later. Right. And then in the store, you didn't need as much air conditioning because you weren't letting all this hot metal cool off. Yeah. It meant the air conditioning load reduced. So just a small change in materials changed this whole energy performance.
It's funny. You learn something new in this industry every day. I didn't even think about that, right? I didn't even think about those industries because when I say industry, I'm always thinking the big players like you were just saying, concrete, cement, glass.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't think of bakeries and because is that considered industrial or commercial?
It's
the big budget
I think it's
scope.
like light industrial, right? It's like light.
I have no idea because I couldn't find the breakdown. Right? This is my problem.
Yeah.
To go back.
No, totally. No, food and beverage, that's an industrial, a lighter industrial.
Okay.
And honestly, it uses a lot of freezing and heating
yeah.
and stuff. There's actually quite a bit of energy going into these factories. Yeah. Freezing too. There's a huge opportunity for companies that have big freezers. You'll see, especially here, every time you open up the back of a truck that has cold things in it, you'll see, of course, these plastic hangers or slabs coming down to prevent the cold from escaping. And there's an opportunity for big industrial freezers to use them actually to balance out the energy load, especially in high renewables places, because you can keep a freezer at minus 18 degrees or whatever. But it doesn't really matter if it's minus 18 or minus 16 for a little while or minus 20. And energy system operators sometimes need that flexibility to say if there's too much supply on the grid, can someone use more power to balance the grid? Or there's not enough supply on the grid, can someone stop using it for a minute to balance things out? Mm-hmm. So these big industrial players who have big freezers, that's a really good option. They can choose to freeze their things a little colder or let them thaw a little bit. It doesn't affect the quality of their produce, but it helps them balance the grid.
Interesting.
So yeah, there's a lot of interplay between these medium-intensive industries.
But that needs data, right? That needs almost real-time data from the distribution side to go back to the users, right?
Yeah, and sometimes you can just offer remote control of your equipment within certain parameters. There's a whole industry around demand response. That's what essentially called responding. It allows you to respond to demand fluctuations. So the grid operator can commission a bunch of energy users to hand over control of their equipment to manage it within certain parameters. And they're trying it even with normal residential appliances. So you can hand over control of your dishwasher or your washer dryer or your fridge. And there can be this is the Internet of Things, right? It can be a smart control of these appliances. So at a macro level, if the grid is suffering with either too much supply or not enough, the grid operator can send a message to these appliances to...
That's so cool.
Yeah, your fridge can stop running for like
instead of, for example,
minutes.
In some countries where you just have blackouts.
Exactly.
You'll just reduce some things that are less essential and still have lights which don't use nearly as much as...
Exactly.
That's really cool. Where is this being done?
It's being done all over the place, definitely in the UK and Europe. It's the kind of smart grid approach, often in a more trial basis, but I know in California there's a lot of energy challenges, so they're rolling it out there. Yeah, it's a really neat way of
that's really cool.
Creating grid flexibility.